The breaking point. The Assembly Hall of the Interstellar Unity had witnessed 8,000 years of galactic governance, its crystalline walls holding memories of 1,000 treaties and 10,000 decisions that shaped the lives of trillions. The hall rose in magnificent tiers, each level reserved for the founding species who had built this institution when most of the galaxy still crawled through primitive ages. At the very top sat the Zenthari, their silver skin gleaming under the amber light that filtered through the dome. Below them, arranged in careful hierarchy, were the Directions with their formidable bulk, the ethereal Lumini who existed partially in dimensions others could barely perceive, the insectoid Krethak with their compound eyes that saw in spectrums beyond normal comprehension, and 10 other elder races who had long ago decided they knew best how the galaxy should be run. Director Marcus Webb stood at the petitioner's platform far below, a simple raised disc that forced speakers to crane their necks upward to address their betters. He had stood here 21 times before over the past 3 decades, and each time he had presented the same request with different words and different evidence. Today would be the 22nd time, and as he looked up at the assembled powers of the known universe, he felt the weight of every human who had ever hoped for something better pressing down on his shoulders. Marcus was not a young man anymore. His hair had gone completely gray during his years of service, and the lines around his eyes told stories of countless negotiations and disappointments. But his back remained straight and his voice remained steady as he began to speak. He did not start with pleasantries this time because pleasantries had accomplished nothing in 21 previous attempts. Instead, he activated the holographic display that materialized in the air around him, showing data that should have been undeniable to anyone viewing it with honest eyes. The images showed human agricultural specialists teaching sustainable farming techniques on 40 worlds that had been facing famine. They showed human medical researchers who had developed vaccines for 17 different plagues that had devastated populations the Council had deemed too far away or too unimportant to help. They showed human engineers maintaining the quantum relay network that connected every inhabited system in the galaxy, a network so complex that only humans seemed willing to do the tedious work of keeping it operational. They showed human peacekeepers patrolling regions where no Council forces would venture, protecting trade routes and refugee populations from raiders and worse things that lurked in the dark spaces between stars. Marcus presented financial data that 3 independent auditing firms had verified. In the past century alone, humanity had contributed labor and resources valued at more than the combined gross planetary products of 12 Council member species. Humans had asked for no payment, no territorial concessions, no preferential trade agreements. They had simply done the work because it needed doing and because they believed that being part of a galactic community meant contributing to that community's welfare. All they had ever requested in return was the same thing they were requesting today, the right to sit at this table not as petitioners or observers but as full members with voting authority and the respect that should come with 3 centuries of unwavering service. The presentation lasted 47 minutes and Marcus knew that every second of it was being recorded and transmitted to the home worlds of every species present. When he finished, he stood in silence and waited for the response he knew was coming because it was the same response he had received 21 times before. Chairman Vothkar of the Zenthari leaned forward in his elevated seat, his face arranged in an expression that probably was meant to convey benevolent wisdom but looked to Marcus like barely concealed contempt. The chairman spoke in that melodious voice that Zenthari were so proud of, thanking humanity for their continued service to the galactic community and praising the human spirit of cooperation and dedication. Then came the words that Marcus could have recited from memory. The chairman explained that while humanity had indeed made valuable contributions, the Council had serious concerns about whether humans possessed the emotional maturity necessary for full membership. He cited examples of human conflicts on Earth, wars that had ended 300 years ago but apparently still disqualified humanity from equal standing. He mentioned the human tendency toward what he called excessive empathy, suggesting that humans became too emotionally invested in problems and made decisions based on feelings rather than logic. Several other Council members nodded in agreement, and Commander Thelnos of the Dracian Empire added that humanity's reluctance to build a proper military force indicated a species too weak to deserve a seat among those who truly shaped galactic policy. The vote proceeded exactly as Marcus had known it would. 15 member species, 15 votes cast, 15 identical answers delivered with varying degrees of diplomatic courtesy. The Lumini representative at least had the grace to abstain rather than voting no, but abstention accomplished nothing except making one being feel slightly better about themselves. The petition was denied and Chairman Vothkar concluded the session by encouraging humanity to continue their valuable work and perhaps reapply in another 50 or 100 years when they had demonstrated further maturity and growth. Something inside Marcus Webb went very quiet in that moment. It was not anger exactly, though anger was certainly present beneath the surface. It was more like a door closing, a final recognition that no amount of service or patience or hope would ever change what these beings thought of humanity. They would accept human labor forever, would praise human dedication and sacrifice, would benefit from every gift humanity offered. But they would never see humans as equals, because seeing humans as equals would require admitting that power and age did not automatically confer wisdom or worth. Marcus had known this intellectually for years, but knowing something and truly accepting it were different things entirely. He bowed to the council, a gesture of respect he no longer felt but performed anyway because grace in defeat mattered even when defeat was inevitable. Then he spoke words that had been prepared months ago, words that humanity's leadership had authorized him to deliver if this petition failed like all the others. His voice carried clearly through the vast chamber as he thanked the council for their consideration and informed them that humanity accepted their decision. Humanity would no longer seek membership in the Interstellar Unity Assembly. Furthermore, effective immediately, all human personnel serving in council territories would be recalled to human-controlled space. All human-maintained systems and infrastructure would be handed over to council authority along with whatever documentation existed. Humanity wished the council well in their future endeavors and hoped that the paths of their peoples might cross again under better circumstances someday. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 5 seconds, but those 5 seconds contained a universe of confusion and disbelief. Chairman Vothkar actually laughed, a sound like crystal chimes that echoed through the chamber. He assured Marcus that such dramatic gestures were unnecessary, that humanity was welcome to continue their work regardless of membership status, that there was no need for such an extreme reaction to a simple administrative decision. Other council members joined in with similar sentiments, treating Marcus's announcement as though it were a child's tantrum rather than a formal policy declaration. Marcus did not argue with them or try to convince them he was serious. He simply bowed once more, turned, and walked out of the assembly hall with steady unhurried steps that never faltered or looked back. Within 6 hours every human diplomatic mission in council space received the same encrypted message. Within 12 hours human vessels began departing from stations and orbital facilities across 200 worlds. Within 1 day the scope of what was happening began to register with local authorities who suddenly realized that the humans were not bluffing or negotiating but actually leaving. Planetary governors sent urgent messages to human administrators asking for clarification or requesting delays or demanding explanations. The responses they received were polite and brief, confirming that yes, humanity was withdrawing all personnel and yes, this decision was final and no, there would be no exceptions or extensions. Dr. Yuki Chen stood in her laboratory on the Vorten homeworld and looked at 30 years of research that she would have to abandon. She had been studying the unique symbiotic ecosystem that allowed Vorten agriculture to thrive in soil that would be toxic to most life forms. She had been 3 months away from publishing findings that could help terraform dozens of marginal worlds. Her Vorten colleagues begged her to stay, promised to protect her from any council interference, offered her citizenship and honors and anything else they could think of. Yuki packed her research carefully, backed up every file she could, and walked away from the work she loved because staying would mean betraying every human who had ever served and been dismissed as unworthy of basic respect. Similar scenes played out on medical stations where human doctors had trained local physicians for decades. On engineering platforms where human technicians had maintained systems no one else fully understood. On agricultural worlds where human specialists had transformed barren land into productive farms. On patrol ships in dangerous regions where human peacekeepers had built trust with populations who had never seen a council representative in their lives. They all received the same message and they all began the long journey home, leaving behind work unfinished and relationships built over lifetimes and dreams of what could have been if only the galaxy had been willing to see them as something more than useful servants. The quantum relay network began experiencing problems within the first week. Nothing catastrophic initially, just small glitches and delays that council technicians assured everyone would be resolved quickly. The human engineers who had maintained the network for a century left behind detailed manuals and training documentation, but manuals could not replace decades of hands-on experience and institutional knowledge that had never been fully recorded because everyone assumed humans would always be there to handle problems. 3 relay stations went offline simultaneously in the outer territories, cutting communication between 16 inhabited systems. Council engineers worked frantically to restore service while spokespeople assured the public this was a temporary setback. By the end of the first month every human vessel had crossed back through the borders of human space and something extraordinary happened that made several council monitoring stations pause in confusion. A barrier appeared, surrounding the entire volume of space that humanity controlled. It was not a physical barrier exactly, though solid matter could not pass through it. It was not an energy shield in any conventional sense, though energy weapons dissipated against it harmlessly. It existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously and displayed technological principles that the Council's best scientists could not begin to explain. More disturbing than its impenetrability was the fact that humanity had apparently possessed this technology for decades or longer and never mentioned it. Never threatened anyone with it. Never used it as leverage in negotiations. Simply kept it in reserve against a day they hoped would never come. The Council sent delegations to the barrier immediately, carrying messages that ranged from diplomatic inquiries to barely veiled threats to outright pleas. Every message passed through the barrier without response. Humanity had gone silent in every possible way, and that silence was somehow more unsettling than any declaration of war could have been. Chairman Vothkar convened an emergency session to discuss the situation, and for the first time in the Assembly's 8,000-year history the discussion was not about how to manage the galaxy but about how to function without the species they had always taken for granted. Liaison Kress of the Vorten delegation stood before the Council and asked a question that no one seemed able to answer. He asked exactly how much humanity had been doing. He asked for a comprehensive audit of every system, every service, every function that humans had performed across Council space. The silence that greeted his question lasted considerably longer than 5 seconds this time. Because the truth was that no one actually knew. Humanity had been so quietly efficient, so consistently reliable, so willing to handle tasks that others found tedious or beneath their dignity, that their work had become invisible. The Council had stopped noticing all the ways that humans held their civilization together because humans never demanded recognition and never made their service conditional on gratitude. Ambassador Riel of the then Confederacy, one of the younger species that had achieved space flight only 3 centuries ago with human assistance, spoke next. Her voice shook with barely controlled fury as she pointed out that her people remembered what the galaxy had been like before humans arrived. They remembered being dismissed as primitives, remembered being exploited by elder species who saw them as resources rather than people, remembered the contempt and casual cruelty that passed for normal in Council dealings with lesser civilizations. Then humans had come, and humans had treated them as equals from the first moment of contact. Humans had shared technology freely, had taught without condescension, had helped build infrastructure and institutions without demanding anything except friendship in return. Her people had assumed this was normal behavior, that all advanced species would treat others with such respect once you got to know them. But the Council had never treated anyone that way. Only humans had. And now humans were gone. The Council session ended without any clear resolution except a growing sense that something fundamental had changed. Chairman Vothkar returned to his private chambers and reviewed the recordings of Marcus Webb's 22 petitions, speeches he had barely listened to when they were delivered. He watched Marcus present evidence that should have been overwhelming, watched him maintain dignity in the face of dismissal, watched him never lose his temper or his hope that reasonable beings would eventually be moved by reasonable arguments. Vothkar had lived for 400 years and governed the Council for 80 of those years. He had negotiated treaties that ended wars and made decisions that affected trillions of lives. He had always believed he was wise, that his age and experience gave him perspective that younger species lacked. But as he watched Marcus Webb walk out of the assembly hall for the final time, Vothkar felt something he had not felt in centuries. He felt ashamed. And he realized that shame had come far too late to matter. The reckoning. The first year after humanity's withdrawal passed in a strange state of denial among the Council's elder species. Chairman Vothkar issued statements assuring member worlds that the disruption was temporary and manageable, that Council resources were more than adequate to handle any gaps in service, that in fact this might prove beneficial by reducing the Assembly's dependence on any single species. The Dracian Military Command went further, suggesting publicly that humanity's departure revealed weakness and that the galaxy was better served by species with proper martial traditions. The Lumini remained largely silent on the matter, their representatives offering only cryptic observations about patterns they perceived in the fabric of causality. Life continued across Council space with an illusion of normalcy that lasted exactly as long as it took for critical systems to begin failing in ways no one knew how to fix. The agricultural crisis on Nethari Prime developed so gradually that no one recognized it as a crisis until crops across an entire continent began dying. Nethari farmers had always struggled with their world's acidic soil and unpredictable growing seasons, problems that human agricultural specialists had solved 15 years earlier by introducing modified nitrogen-fixing bacteria and establishing crop rotation schedules calibrated to local conditions. The human team had trained Nethari agronomists extensively, had left comprehensive documentation, had created what they believed was a self-sustaining system. What they had not anticipated was that the Nethari government would reassign most of those trained agronomists to other duties once the humans left, assuming the farms would simply continue functioning automatically. When the bacterial colonies began dying off due to subtle changes in soil chemistry, no one noticed until food production dropped by 40% and emergency grain reserves started depleting at alarming rates. The Nethari governor sent urgent requests to the council for agricultural assistance and was informed that experts would be dispatched within 3 to 4 standard months due to scheduling constraints and resource allocation priorities. The governor then did what governors had been doing for generations when they needed immediate help and sent a message to the Human Agricultural Development Corps. The message bounced back with an automated response stating that this communication channel was no longer monitored. Nethari officials tried alternate contact methods, tried reaching human diplomatic missions that no longer existed, tried everything they could think of while their people began rationing food and protests erupted in cities where hunger had been unknown for 2 decades. By the time council agricultural specialists finally arrived, the damage was irreversible for that growing season and 16 million Nethari faced starvation before the next harvest could be brought in. Similar patterns emerged across dozens of worlds. The water purification systems on Kilo's station began producing contaminated output because no one had maintained the biological filtration components that human engineers had installed. The medical research facility on Threshold experienced a catastrophic data loss when their quantum storage system crashed and technicians discovered that all the redundancy protocols had been designed and monitored by humans who had taken their knowledge with them. Trade routes through the Saros Nebula that had been safe for a century suddenly became hunting grounds for pirate fleets because human patrol ships no longer maintained the careful balance of deterrence and enforcement that had kept predators at bay. Each incident in isolation seemed manageable, unfortunate but not catastrophic. The problem was that incidents were not occurring in isolation but cascading across the entire network of council space in a pattern that revealed just how thoroughly human work had been woven into the fabric of galactic civilization. The quantum relay network represented the most visible and most critical failure. Humanity had not invented the network, that technology dated back thousands of years to the early days of the Council's formation. But the network had grown exponentially over those millennia, adding nodes and relay stations and complexity that eventually exceeded the ability of its original designers to maintain. By the time humans encountered the Council 300 years ago, the network was already showing signs of instability. Human engineers had volunteered to help, had spent decades studying the system's architecture, had developed new maintenance protocols and built redundancy into nodes that had been operating on the edge of failure. They had done this work quietly and efficiently while council engineers focused on more prestigious projects, and no one had objected because keeping an aging network functional was tedious unglamorous labor that no one else wanted to do anyway. Now that network was dying. Not all at once in some dramatic collapse but node by node, sector by sector, as components failed and no one knew how to repair them. The technical manuals humans had left behind were comprehensive but written for technicians with baseline understanding of principles that apparently only humans had bothered to truly master. Council engineers tried following the instructions and found themselves confused by references to systems they could not identify or procedures that assumed knowledge they did not possess. Within 8 months 47 relay stations had gone permanently offline, cutting real-time communication to more than 100 inhabited worlds. Within a year that number had doubled and panic was beginning to set in among populations who had grown up taking instant galactic communication for granted. Commander Thelnos of the Dracian Empire stood before the council and demanded answers with a fury that shook the assembly hall's ancient walls. He wanted to know why trade was collapsing and why his merchant fleets were being raided and why colonies were going dark and why nothing seemed to work anymore. The Drexians had built an empire on strength and conquest, had carved out their territory through military might and maintained it through intimidation. But even the Drexians had relied on human doctors to treat diseases their own physicians could not cure, had relied on human engineers to maintain space stations their warriors used, had relied on human negotiators to establish the trade agreements that fed their economy. Thelnos had called humans weak, had mocked their preference for cooperation over domination, had voted against their membership petition without a second thought. Now his empire was fracturing and he was discovering that strength meant nothing when your infrastructure was falling apart and you had no idea how to fix it. Chairman Vothkar appointed investigation committees to analyze the situation and determine exactly what functions humans had been performing. The committees worked for 6 months and produced reports that were terrifying in their implications. Humans had been maintaining life support systems on 73 orbital habitats that housed combined populations of 4 billion people. Humans had been operating medical research facilities on 31 worlds and sharing their findings freely with any species that wanted them. Humans had been teaching in universities and training centers across 200 planets, passing on knowledge that other species had hoarded or sold but humans had simply given away. Humans had been mediating disputes between species who would not listen to council arbitrators but somehow trusted human neutrality. Humans had been doing 10,000 different jobs, large and small, that no one had noticed because the work was always done before anyone realized it needed doing. The financial analysis was even more damning. Forensic economists calculated that humanity had contributed an estimated 800 trillion credits worth of labor and resources over 3 centuries while receiving perhaps 30 trillion in direct compensation. The remaining 770 trillion represented pure gift, service performed because humans believed that being part of a community meant contributing to that community without constantly demanding payment or recognition. The council had accepted this arrangement as natural, had even felt slightly superior about it, believing that humanity's generosity demonstrated their naive idealism compared to the cold practical wisdom of elder species. No one had considered that the arrangement might be unsustainable, not because humans would run out of resources but because humans would eventually run out of patience.